Hello, we are reading Nate Saint on a Wing and a Prayer by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are on chapter 8, titled A Perfect Takeoff. The air was crisp and clear. It was the day before New Year's Eve, 1948, and Nate was whistling to himself as he loaded up the Stinson aircraft. As he positioned suitcases and boxes, he couldn't help thinking about Marge. He had just come from the guest house where she was staying in Quito, and the good news was that everything with the pregnancy was fine, and the baby was due any day now, maybe even on New Year's Day. That would be an easy birthday to remember, Nate thought. Once the Stinson was loaded, Mrs. Tidmarsh and her 12-year-old son Bob were ready to board the plane. Nate helped Mrs. Tidmarsh into the back seat of the plane. Bob, holding a bag of candies, climbed into the front seat. Nate smiled to himself as he saw the look of excitement in Bob's eyes. It reminded him of how he'd been when he first took his flight with Sam. Nate buckled his seatbelt across his lap and made sure his two passengers did the same. He cranked the Stinson's engine to life, looked over his gauges, and then checked to make sure his flaps and ailerons were working properly. He set the flaps for takeoff. There was no one at the airfield to wave goodbye to them, so Nate revved the engine and taxied to the end of the runway. As he positioned the plane for takeoff, he checked the windsock. It was almost still, except for a slight crosswind from the east. Nate gunned the engine, and the Stinson headed down the runway for a perfect takeoff. Although located 9,300 feet above sea level, Quito is in a big valley surrounded by high snow-covered peaks. Nate looked at the mountains he would have to gain altitude to cross. As the Stinson vibrated with the engine at full throttle, he looked at the altimeter to check his rate of ascent out of Quito. He was 200 feet off the ground and beyond the boundary of the Quito airfield. Below were cultivated fields. Nate glanced across at Bob, whose eyes were as big as saucers as he took everything in. Suddenly, from nowhere, a violent downdraft slammed into the Stinson. The bag of candies Bob was holding flew out of his hand, and the suitcases in the luggage compartment at the back were hurled against the roof of the plane. Nate knew they were in trouble. He didn't have enough altitude to contend with the downdraft this strong. He jerked the control wheel to keep the wings level as he tried to maneuver out of the unusually strong air current. But the airplane was dropping too fast. It was plummeting, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The last thing Nate remembered was a plowed field rushing up to meet the Stinson. Nate opened his eyes and squinted at the bright light. He was in a large room with tiled walls, and people were moving around him. He heard voices. "Give him 10 more milligrams of morphine," someone said. The words seemed to float by him. He felt a prick in his arms, and then everything went blank. Later, Nate had no idea how much later, he opened his eyes again. This time he was in a smaller room, and Marge was standing over him. As he moved, she patted him on the hand. "Try not to move," she said. But he couldn't have moved, even if he had wanted to. His body, from neck to hips, was encased in a giant plaster cast. His left foot was also in a cast. Marge told him he had a compression fracture on his 4th lumbar vertebra and a severely pulled ligament in his left ankle. His back was going to take a long time to heal. Nate asked about his passengers, and Marge told him Mrs. Tidmarsh had broken the small bones in both lower legs, and Bob had escaped with only bumps and bruises. Both of them would make a full recovery. Marge, who had thought Nate would be visiting her in the hospital any day soon, was now in charge of a badly injured husband. At that moment, Nate was glad she'd become a nurse instead of the mathematics teacher she'd set out to be. After talking at length with the doctors in Quito, Marge told Nate that they weren't sure how best to treat his injuries and that he ought to go back to the United States to be treated by a North American doctor with more experience in this type of injury. Nate's heart sank. He didn't have the money for him to fly home. They didn't have the money for him to fly home, but Marge was one step ahead of him. Before he sank into depression over the situation, she reminded him he was an Army veteran, and as such, he could get treatment at any Army hospital free of charge. There was a large military hospital at the United States base in Panama, and Marge had already made arrangements for Nate to be flown there. The U.S. military had a cargo plane stationed in Quito that would ferry Nate to the hospital in Panama for treatment. Because Marge's pregnancy was too far advanced for her to travel, she would stay in Quito and have the baby. With a cast covering half his body, Nate looked like a mummy as he was carried on a stretcher to the military transport plane. As he crossed the tarmac to the plane, he caught a glimpse of the yellow Stinson, which lay in a crumpled heap in front of a hangar where it had been dragged. The fuselage was broken in half, and the engine and landing gear had been ripped right off the plane. As he looked at the wreckage, Nate knew it was a blessing that he was alive. On the flight to Panama, Nate had to stay lying on his back on the stretcher since his cast didn't bend at the waist. He passed the time counting the number of rivets in the bulkhead. It was frustrating for him to be only a few feet from the cockpit and not to be able to go up front to visit with the flight crew. At the hospital in Panama, a battery of tests were run on Nate. After reviewing the results, the doctors decided his cast was immobilizing the wrong part of his back. The old cast would need to be cut off and a new one put on. That was the bad news. The good news arrived on January 10th, 1949, the day after he arrived in Panama. It came in the form of a telegram from Quito, and it read, "Kathy Joan Saint, born January 9th. All is well. Love, Marge." Nate let out a whoop of joy. Everything was fine. He was now a dad. He wrote straight back to Marge and said, "Honey, don't be afraid to give that little gal lots of loving. She'll need the practice for when her daddy gets home. May the Lord guide our steps until we are making footprints side by side again." As he lay in his hospital bed, Nate played the accident over and over again in his mind. There were so many questions that needed answers. How had it happened? What could be done to stop it happening again? How had the 9,300-foot elevation affected things? Obviously, the mountains around the airfield caused the wind to move in unnatural patterns, and that was almost certainly the cause of the sudden downdraft. Still, if he'd had a bit more airspree, the whole accident might never have happened. Letters between Nate and MAF headquarters in Los Angeles hashed over every detail of the short flight. Finally, everyone concluded that the sudden downdraft had caused the accident, but they also noted that in mountains at that elevation, downdrafts should be anticipated. Nate also wondered whether there could have been some way to prevent his back from being broken. The lap belt had kept his hips in place, but the impact had flung the top half of his body forward, fracturing his back. What was needed were shoulder harnesses as well as lap belts. A shoulder harness would have held him in his seat and stopped him from being jerked around and injured more. Nate wrote to Jim Truxton and told him his thoughts on fitting shoulder harnesses to MAF planes. Jim thought it was a good idea and ordered all MAF aircraft to be fitted with them immediately. Nate spent a month at the hospital in Panama before doctors decided he was well enough to return to Ecuador. His back was healing nicely, but he had strict instructions from his doctors. He was to wear his cast for another 5 months and then have it cut off. After that time, he would have to wear a back brace, which the doctors made especially for him, until his back muscles were strong again. That would probably take another 5 months. The military transport plane flew Nate back to Quito. This time, though, Nate got to stand up for the whole trip because of his new cast. It was tiresome standing for the whole flight, but despite his weary legs, by the end of the journey, he couldn't wait to see Marge and new baby Kathy, who were waiting at the airport to meet him. His face beamed as he took his first look at the little blonde bundle Marge was carrying. The newly enlarged Saint family spent several days in Quito. While there, HCJB, the ministry whose guest house Marge had been staying in, asked Nate to talk on the radio. The name HCJB was short for Heralding Christ Jesus Blessings, and the ministry's goal was to send Christian programming around the world by radio. Quito's high elevation and proximity to the equator meant there was little atmospheric interference of radio signals from the Earth's magnetic field. Strange as it seemed, Quito, high in the Andes Mountains, was a perfect place from which to share the gospel message with the world. During his many days in the hospital, Nate had been thinking about the idea of expendability, and that was the subject of his radio talk. Expendability comes from the word expend, which means to use up. Nate used the term to mean that Christians need to offer themselves to be used up by God, however he wishes to use them. During his talk, Nate said that missionaries constantly face expendability, and people who do not know the Lord ask why in the world we waste our lives as missionaries. They forgot that they too are expending their lives. They forget that when their lives are spent and the bubble has burst, they will have nothing of eternal significance to show for the years they have wasted. Some might say, isn't it too great a price to pay? When missionaries consider themselves, their lives before God, they consider themselves expendable. And in our personal lives as Christians, isn't the same thing true? Isn't the price small in the light of God's infinite love? Those who know the joy of leading a stranger to Christ and those who have gone to tribes who have never heard the gospel gladly count themselves expendable. Nate knew what he was talking about when he talked of expendability. He had nearly been killed in a plane crash, yet it didn't deter him. He was ready to get back in an airplane and serve other missionaries. Nate, Marge, and Kathy took the bus back to Shelmera. Once again, Nate couldn't sit down for the trip. He spent the entire 13 hours standing on the back bumper of the bus, clinging to a handrail. If the doctors could see me now, he thought, they would never have released me. Still, Nate quickly forgot about the discomfort of the journey as the bus rolled down the dusty road and the new house at Shelmera came into view. After 13 hours on the bus, Nate and Marge were both a little wobbly. They staggered into the yard of their brown-stained house, whose timber had been cut from trees that once grew where the house now stood. The aluminum roof glistened in the sun. As they settled into their new home, Nate and Marge grew to love it. Marge enjoyed the sense of being almost outdoors because the house had large open windows in every room, covered only with screens. The house was also almost bug-free because the foundations were concrete pillars, each with a moat around it filled with oil, barring entrance by termites and other insects. Of course, there were a few things the house didn't have, like electricity and running water. To take a bath, the saints had to wait for rain. They never had to wait for long, though, because Shelmera had more than 32 feet of rain a year. When it rained, they would gather up soap and a towel and head over to where the rainwater flowed off the edge of the runway. The water flowed into a ditch there. The water flowing into a ditch there made a good shower. Nate was not the type to sit around or stand around, as his cast forced him to do. With his cast still on, he managed to find plenty of jobs to keep himself busy. He dug post holes for a fence around the yard and laid gravel to make a taxiway from the airstrip to the hangar that had been built next to the house. Unfortunately, the hangar was empty because there was still no replacement plane stationed at Shelmera. Missionaries had to revert to hiking through the jungle for days to get where they wanted to go. When Nate heard about one such trip that nearly claimed the life of a missionary, he became concerned. 3 missionaries had been trekking out from the isolated Makuma station. While crossing a turbulent river on a raft, they lost some of their equipment. Then one of the missionaries became violently ill from fatigue. Because their food rations were dwindling, he struggled on with the others. Their ordeal lasted for 6 days, and when they finally reached Shelmera, the one missionary's feet and legs were so swollen he could barely walk. A replacement airplane was needed at Shelmera, and it was needed fast. But before Nate could write to MAF to stress the urgency of the need, he received word from Jim Truxton in Los Angeles that a replacement plane was on its way to Shelmera. Several days later, Hobie Lawrence, an MAF pilot sent to replace Nate until he was able to fly again, piloted the yellow 4-seater Piper Pacer across the Andes to Shelmera, where he pulled it to a halt in front of the new hangar. Nate was waiting outside. Hobie settled into the house with Nate and Marge. Soon, he was busy servicing the missionary bases across the Orient with the new plane. The missionaries were deeply grateful to again have air service to assist their work in the jungle. Finally, 5 months passed, and it was time for Nate to take off the uncomfortable and, by now, very dirty cast. Marge walked with him to the Shell Medical Clinic. She carried with her the back brace that had been specially made for Nate in Panama. Nate would have to wear the brace right away because his back would be too weak and floppy for him to stand up without it. At least, that's what the doctors thought. After the cast was taken off, Nate walked home with his brace on. It felt just as uncomfortable as the cast had, but with one big difference. Nate could take the brace off if he wanted to. And that's exactly what he did. When he got home, he hung it up in the corner of his closet and never wore it again. His back wasn't weak and floppy at all. The digging and gravel laying he'd been doing had made it good as new. Now, with the accident finally behind him, Nate was eager to get back to flying. He had some new ideas he wanted to try out.